It is a great joy to participate in this very important conference on woke capitalism, and in particularly the woke corporation. I am very grateful to NAPA and CUA for their leadership in addressing this very important question for business today. While this phenomenon of woke corporation has been rather intense in the last year, it seems to me that it started to become more noticeable in public about 10 years ago, particularly over a series of forms of legislation on the question of marriage. And it's precisely here that I want to start with a story at that time. In 2012, the state of Minnesota put on the ballot an amendment to the Constitution to define marriage between one man and one woman. And several major corporations here in Minnesota, General Mills particularly was very vocal, Target Corporation, Carlson Companies, all came out very forcefully against the marriage amendment because they largely were arguing that it was an anti-business piece of legislation. And in one very large Minnesota company, I have a friend of mine who serves as a senior executive on that team. And the issue about how their corporation would respond in light of what General Mills and Target and others were doing came up to one of their major executive meetings. But prior to the meeting, there was great pressure building to follow the decision of General Mills and others. There was the internal pressure from an LGBT network within the company that obviously latched on to what was General Mills was doing, was going to try to do the same with this company. There was also one of the senior executive leaders who was very much strongly in favor of coming out against the amendment, similar to what General Mills did. And then, of course, there were major media outlets who themselves were clearly against the amendment and were requesting interviews and statements from the company about how they were planning to respond. In one sense, we could say that simply without any type of intervention, the likely direction that this corporation would go into was largely to come out to oppose the amendment. My friend, who was the only Catholic on this executive committee and who was actually for the amendment, had to make a case for the company not to take a stance on the amendment. And he did two things. One is he made an argument, and two, he witnessed. That is, he drew upon the intellectual dimension of his faith, and he also showed courage. Certainly two very important qualities of leaders today. His argument went like this. His argument was that companies should not speak for all employees on political and cultural topics of this nature. Companies should have a deep respect for its own boundaries of what they should speak for and what they should not speak for. He explained that the corporation had a collective character or personality, and that there was a power to this collectivity that needs limits, just like the state. And while executives and employees certainly have a right and freedom to their own political and cultural views, they do not have a right for the company to, in a sense, espouse those particular views. And here he also argued, almost prophetically, that if the company takes a position on the definition of marriage, where does it stop? Do they take positions on abortion, religious liberty, critical gender and race theory? Do they aggressively promote these views, not only in legislation, but also in their own training and development programs? And of course, the answer in these last 10 years is that corporations are increasingly doing so, which is, of course, why we're having this conference. But the second thing my friend did is he witnessed, and particularly he witnessed to his senior team. And so after having this very intense conversation in that meeting, he wrote an email to his team, and I want to quote it, and here it is, quote, "In the spirit of honesty, respectful candor, and the hope we truly value differences in this company, I personally fully support the Marriage Act. It is extremely important to me personally and to my Catholic faith," end quote. My friend did not expect his company to take his view on marriage, right? But he also did not expect his company, where he worked for over 30 years, to speak out against his deeply held views of marriage. As an executive, he had a deep sense of his leadership and authority in the company. And up until that point, there was never a direct conflict between his belief as a Catholic and his belief in the stances of the company. So there's a lot more to say about this case, but we simply don't have the time. But I do want to let you know that actually the company did not come out and make a statement against the marriage amendment, and my friend's argument and witness had good effect. But what this mini case raises for us is the importance of having a deep sense of clarity on what is the good that business does. What my friend saw quite clearly and quite early is that the so-called woke corporation has the capacity to undermine that good. And so what I'd like to do in this talk is three things. One is define very clearly what do we mean by the good that business does. And then number two, in particular, I want to talk about a particular dimension of this good, what I would call good work. And three, and this is really in light of the title of this talk, right? Why, in the sense, the displacement of good work for bad woke will often undermine the very nature of the goodness of what a corporation should do. In particular, I'm going to be drawing upon a document that was issued by the Vatican office called the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development. The name of the document is called The Vocation of the Business Leader, which actually speaks very clearly and forcefully about the importance of this good. So, point number one, what is the good that a business does? Certainly within this phenomenon that we're talking about in terms of the woke corporation, it's particularly forcing us, particularly as Christians, to be very clear on this question. And particularly for us as Catholics, we have a long tradition in the church that speaks about this. And so this first slide speaks it, and he speaks it from the vocation of the business leader, and it says there are three principal goods to business: good work, good goods, good wealth. So, good work. Organizing work where employees develop their gifts and talents. Good goods. Making goods that are truly good and services that truly serve. And good wealth. Creating sustainable wealth and distributing it justly. There is a lot to be said about these three goods, about how they relate to each other. And actually, in the talk by Andreas Widmer, he's going to be talking about the second good, good goods. But what I want to do in this talk is focus more specifically on this question of what is good work. And to understand what we mean by good work, and particularly to understand what we might call the moral and spiritual root system of what we mean by good work, we have to understand this very important principle called subsidiarity. And there are two voices I want to bring out in here. The first voice is by Benedict XVI. And he says this about subsidiarity. Subsidiarity respects personal dignity by recognizing in the person a subject who is always capable of giving something to others. And the second voice, Pope Francis, who says subsidiarity grants freedom to develop the capabilities present at every level of society. This principle of subsidiarity came into the lexicon of Catholic social thought in 1931 by Pope Pius XI, and he wrote an encyclical letter called Quadragesimo Anno. And what he was concerned about was the increasing totalitarian regimes that were occurring within Europe. And what they were doing is that they were absorbing the gifts of families, of volunteer organizations, of individuals, and in particular the church. And what's really key to understand about Pius XI is that he wasn't so much concerned about these regimes taking away people's autonomy, although that was certainly the problem. What he was concerned, and there was a deeply theological understanding of it, is that they were taking away their gifts that God gave them. And it's precisely through our gifts that we develop and flourish as human beings. And so there's a logic of gift that's operating here, and that this logic actually influences and should help us understand how we approach a corporation. And so if you take this principle of subsidiarity and this logic of gift, when one goes to a corporation, there are three things institutionally every leader who really wants to take seriously this question of good work should be thinking about. The first one is what we might call person-centered job design. It defines work as broadly as possible to draw on the gifts of coworkers. The second point we should be thinking about is developing of people That is, those closest to the work often know the most about the work, especially when educated and equipped. And so when one can see that the whole idea of subsidiarity is moving in these particular areas, that I'm really concerned about the gifts of the employees in front of me, and that I want to develop them, it gets to this third point, right? That engaged and equipped employees who contribute to good goods and good wealth create conditions for an authentic community of work. And it's often in that community of work where we can have relationships that flourish. And actually, we can even come to the idea that there can even be possibilities of having friendships in that workplace. So that's subsidiarity. That's beginning to define what we mean by this good work. But the question we might ask, and certainly often business people do, well, how would you know? What metrics would you use? And we don't have time to go through all the metrics, but let me highlight one very popular metric that I think actually does help us to understand whether we have this sense of good work and whether we have this sense of subsidiarity. And it's a metric that has been very popularized by Gallup. And on your screen, this Gallup study is from 2017. And it's basically, it's a measurement about whether employees are engaged. And it's very interesting. The data is not very pleasing. Because on average, Gallup points out that approximately 70% of U.S. employees are disengaged. Now that's on average. They point out that a world-class organization will often have a 75% engagement. So if average is 70% disengaged, a world-class is almost flipping it, where it's 75% engaged. And it's light in this slide that I want to raise the question, which is at the heart of what this talk is about. What does a woke corporation do to such numbers? So let me hypothesize a bit. And here's my hypothesis. I think it does two things. A woke corporation will both widen disengagement and distract the engaged. The woke corporation widens and intensifies disengagement among those who do not share those beliefs that it's often trying to, in a sense, put forward. And it will often distract the engaged from what is actually good of what the corporation should do. So let me highlight both problems. The idea of those who are, it widens the disengagement and it distracts the engaged. First, widens the disengagement. I serve I'm the board chair of a manufacturing company here in the Twin Cities, and the CEO and I were talking about this issue of the woke corporation recently. And he mentioned to me a very interesting story of a friend of his who was very talented, very hardworking, and very productive. But as this kind of woke phenomena has kind of entered his corporation, and largely they were bringing in the whole idea of critical race theory, critical gender theory, white fragility, accusations of bigotry, all those particular things, there was something that he, in a sense, it was not connecting to who he was. And there was a belief conflict. And what was interesting also, by the way, is that there was a forcefulness of a kind of political and social statements that was coming down from top management. And there was no openness to have an engagement on this question. And what happened to this employee is he shut down. You know, he was old enough where he wasn't interested in going to look for another job. The economy that we have right now, obviously for many, is not very good. But it caused a shutdown. And here's what my concern is about what the woke corporation can do. And there are three things that I have concerns about. One is that what the woke corporation can do is it fosters what we might call Q&S employees. This is a term that Matthew Kelly has popularized, Q&S. These are people who quit but stay. What happened in that time is that this was a very productive employee, but as this ideology became kind of cascades down into the organization, he starts to shut down and he quits, but he's staying. He's going to do his job, but nothing more. The second thing it does is it results in a loss of collective intelligence. Companies are only as smart as the collective intelligence of all their employees. And what happened here is they lost this employee's gifts and talents and contributions. And three, it actually increases a transactional culture, right? There's a lot of fear that gets generated in an organization like this, and actually a loss of trust. And instead of being a community of persons, that woke corporation, the tendency is that it could be a collection of individuals. Again, more to be said there. But second point I want to bring up is it distracts the engaged. And there's a lot to be said about this one as well. But if you think about it, a good company will often have healthy and training, they will have healthy training and development budgets. But what happens in often woke corporations is that a disproportionate share of those budgets go into often diversity training that often have, in a sense, ideological components to it, and often, by the way, are often not very effective. There's been several articles, one, by the way, by the Harvard Business Review, on why diversity programs fail. So there's a lot to be said about the problems of woke and where this is at, but let me begin to conclude. And the question for us is, what does one do? And particularly when one has to witness and face this increasing phenomenon of the woke corporation. And so here I want to come back to my friend in the opening case. The first thing that was on his mind was this clarity of what is the good business does. And one of the things he was talking to me about when I was interviewing him for this talk, he talked about the importance of having a true north, right? And that is this whole idea that I know what the good is this company should be doing. And that's why the vocation of the business leader is an important document, because it has a way of defining what that true north is. And when one faces those pressures, one has the capacity in which to, in a sense, resist it. Because here's a real challenge, and this has been said by so many people. If we marry the spirit of our own generation, we'll be a widow in the next. Second thing my friend had a deep sense of was good work. He had a deep sense, matter of fact, he understood this principle of subsidiarity. He understood that his role in that company was to foster the good work among his employees. And that built up a lot of credibility that actually gave him the ability to exercise influence that actually got the company not to take a stance against that marriage amendment. Because as Christians, our vocation is not disengagement, no matter what happens. And there's a great temptation there, particularly in many organizations that we have. Things don't go our way, and we often do the submarine effect. Our vocation is engagement, to create the conditions for that good work to go on. And lastly, I want to talk about this idea of praying for the logic of gift. We are no longer in Christendom, right? We are in a new apostolic age where we are in need of great grace. And one sign of that grace is the logic of gift. And by the way, this is not cheap grace. This is not one that hovers over like a kind of a sentimental piety. This is a grace that transforms a logic about how we understand the corporations that we enter into. And so a sign of this grace is this deep sense that we see the gifts in others, and we draw out those gifts and create conditions for those gifts to help them flourish as human beings. So let me close this talk with a quote from a woman, Dorothy, who I think has captured the importance of this grace and this logic of gift. Dorothy Day was the co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement with a man named Peter Morin in 1931. And she would often talk about Peter because she felt that Peter gave her the kind of intellectual vision about what this movement was about. And here's what she says about Peter Morin, which I find be quite profound. She says this: he, Peter Morin, did not begin by tearing down or by painting so intense a picture of misery and injustice that you burned to change the world. Instead, he arose in you a sense of your own capacities for work, for accomplishment. He made you feel that you and all people had great and generous hearts with which to love God. If you once recognized this fact in yourself, you would expect it and find it in others. The art of human contacts, Peter called it happily. Peter arose in people a deep sense of gifts. He saw in people the gifts for them to be given, to create good work, to create good goods, to create good wealth, right? We are in strange and volatile times. But as Christians, we know that the fruit grows in the valleys. And despite the problems we have with the woke corporation, this can be an opportunity for us to grow more deeply in the faith that has been given to us. St. Augustine in the Confessions says, "The house of my soul is too small for you to come to it. May it be enlarged by you." May this time, as difficult as it is, can enlarge the good work that we are called to do. And God bless you.